This channel is supported by TrueFire. TrueFire is an online library of lessons from some of my favourite players. There's thousands of lessons on there. You can use the promo code JNC40 to get 40% off of any of their courses. So I was scrolling through Instagram the other day, or maybe not even for very long, but what came up was this Frank Zappa excerpt from an interview. And in it, he kind of talked about his approach to the guitar, and he talks about it. Someone asks him, like, are you a great guitarist? And he says,
I'm specialized. What I do on the guitar has very little to do with what other people do on the guitar.
And he goes on to explain that
most of the other guitar solos that you hear performed on stage have been practiced over and over and over again. They go out there and they play the same one every night, and it's really just spotless. My theory is this: I have a basic mechanical knowledge of the operation of the instrument, and I got an imagination. And when the time comes up in the song to play a solo, it's me against the laws of nature. I don't know what I'm going to play, I don't know what I'm going to do. I know roughly how long I have to do it, and it's a game where you have a piece of time and you get to decorate it.
This kind of resonates with me because on this channel, what you see me do pretty much every single video is kind of start from nothing and then improvise for a period of time. And the way that Frank described it, it was really interesting to me as well. He said you've got like potentially a set amount of time and you decorate that time. And it could be different every single time. It could be relatively similar. But I think it's interesting to think that even someone like Frank Zappa feels that he needs to kind of differentiate what was going on from some other aspects of what might be happening. Now, these days online, I think this is even more the case, that you have some people that do a lot of improvisation. So you might have someone like Tom Quayle. And on the other hand, you have people that have, you know, these written solos or these written jams or these prepared bits of stuff, and it's I feel like difficult to really differentiate between the two in some ways as a viewer. The only real way is to find people playing the same thing note for note, and you can find examples of Martin Miller, for example, has a few things that he plays note for note. If you watch a live video and if you watch another live video, you can find like little bits and pieces of this. People that don't do this, Alan Holdsworth, which is actually Frank Zappa's favourite guitarist at the time of the interview, Eric Johnson. There are people that improvise, you know, Jonathan Kreisberg, especially in the jazz world, loads of these guitarists really improvise all the time. People that don't so much, you know, like people like Steve Vai, maybe Satriani, Slash, some of the kind of guitar gods potentially they write their solos, Richie Sambora, and play these things which are played note for note and played the same way each night. Now, that's not to say that that's a worse thing, but I think it's important to know, because you might come to my channel and you think, oh, this is something that he's worked on for ages, but actually these things are just spur of the moment kind of improvisation. And I've made it sort of a thing that I like to try and improvise and be spontaneous. And that's one of the things that Frank Zappa talks about as well, about being spontaneous. I think in some ways it can help to keep the guitar fresh if you're coming to it pretty much fresh every day, instead of maybe writing. But at the same time, there is a negative that I think some of the things that people write necessarily ends up being a lot better than what you would just improvise in the moment in a lot of cases. That's kind of the flip side to this. So if you get too focused on improvisation, maybe your writing kind of suffers, and that's a thing to kind of toss up in your own head. I think it's nice to be able to do both, but I think generally people tend to focus more on one than the other, and you get people, you know, some incredibly successful people that may not be great improvisers, and I don't think necessarily even matters. You know, does it matter whether or not someone who's able to play like Tosin Abasi or the guys from Polyphia, does it matter if they don't necessarily excel in jam situations? So you've seen, for example, that the boys from Polyphia joined on stage with Paul Gilbert and Steve Vai and stuff, and sometimes what they play in that doesn't really sound necessarily amazing versus their recorded stuff, which obviously sounds very different. What I would be looking for, and the thing that I don't want to be sort of guilty of, is presenting my playing in a way which is worlds different from what you would see if you sat in a room with me. And there are probably some of you watching this who have sat in a room with me. Hopefully it's not like a misrepresentation thing going on, because I think that can be the difficult thing for me, because if you've got this person who's presenting something one way, it can be sometimes, I think, a little bit demotivating for someone watching that to think, oh, this is this unattainable level that I'll never get to, versus if you saw what their playing was actually like in the moment on stage or whatever, then it might make you feel a whole different way. So I think there are legitimately godlike improvisers, you know, Jonathan Kreisberg, Mike Marino, Gilad Hexelman, these kind of players. There are players that can really execute on a pretty incredible level, like Jason Richardson, who maybe isn't the greatest improviser in the world. I think these things exist and can exist and be fine as well. It's two different kind of sides of the coin. But if we are interested in improvisation, let's kind of talk about what you can do and kind of my tips for this sort of stuff, I guess. I do get asked by people about how to get better at improvisation, or that people that may even think that some of my stuff might be written, or that some things are prepared or whatever. And I guess the question might be like, how do you get good, how do you get confident, and how do you get better at improvisation? The one key factor is time, and what this really means is that you need to make this a real focus. People that don't focus on being able to improvise don't get good at improvising. And that for me, every single day I'm improvising, playing over pieces of music. I play quite a bit of jazz and practice over that sort of stuff, playing along with records and trying to always be sort of trying to make a tune with a guitar. And I think that is kind of the main thing, that your key focus, or one of them, is on being able to actually do this thing. Without a load of time sunk into this, then I don't think you can really tackle it. There are really no cheat codes to improvisation. I think you just need to spend time. And what's really key about this improvisation thing is that there's a different mindset thing where you're really just focusing on certain aspects. So what I really focus on is, do I know where is home? And what I mean by that is, what key am I in? And the other thing is that I try to spend a lot of focus on the actual time, where the beat is. So I might be focusing on where the snare drum is, or I might be focusing on where the click is if I'm recording to a click. By really honing in on those littler aspects, you can hopefully get better at kind of improvising. And one of the key things that happens when people, I think, get into this improvising thing is that they feel like their ideas maybe don't go anywhere, and maybe they feel like sort of they're just jumping from one idea to the next, and maybe there's not like a very clear narrative throughout stuff. And all of that stuff, I think, is improved over time, and it becomes an intuitive sort of thing where, you know, you think, right, well, this is how solos go. There is this sort of natural progression where it's like, well, there's a peak, there are these other aspects, there's a time for the thing to be fast, there's a time for the thing to be slow, there's a time where you want a big kind of bend here or whatever. But I think a lot of this stuff, probably you practice it, and then in the moment you want to be forgetting what you've practiced and just try and be in the moment with whatever you're playing. Things that I would really encourage you to practice therefore would be in the practice session, maybe you practice landing specifically on a beat or starting a phrase specifically on a beat, so it shows that you are listening to where the beat is. So you say, right, I'm going to target that I start this line on beat 2 and end it on beat 2 or something like that. Also practicing soloing across a bar line, or not just having lines which are kind of sporadic and change with every chord. Try and practice these lines and ideas that go for a bit longer. And ways that you could achieve this, I would practice having this kind of idea of an A, B, A concept. So what we do is state an idea, that's A. We repeat the idea, that's A again. Then we move away from that idea, that's B. And then A, we restate the original idea again. Now this is definitely a compositional technique, but it's something that can be done in real time as well in improvising. What you need to be doing is sort of listening as you play and starting to be able to replicate the thing that you just did again. And that's really good practice, I find. So if you're kind of checking in with yourself whilst you're improvising, one thing to do to check whether you're listening to what you're playing is to try and be able to repeat an idea that you just played again. And this is surprisingly difficult, but it requires this level of like, I'm listening to what's happening, but I'm also present, and I'm also able to replicate it. Really good practice, surprisingly difficult, but useful. Another kind of thing to do is to try and sort of maybe sing an idea before you play it, and see if you can come up with an idea and then execute it. I think this can be a really useful thing because it's sort of training your ear-hand connection and trying to get these things working together. One other really good thing that you could try to do, and I think this might be a good technique in general, is to have one aspect of a solo that you have planned. So it might be a fast line that you've prepared, or a lick that you've heard, or maybe if you're learning someone else's solo, you keep one aspect of it the same and you improvise around it. And this was kind of the idea where Frank Zappa was talking about your decorating time. Now, what if we have, 16 bars, you might have 4 bars of it that are kept the same at the start. You might have 4 bars at the end that you keep the same. And then this middle part you decorate. That's kind of an interesting concept, and it can keep you in this idea of, right, I'm executing an idea, and then you're jumping out to improvisation and then jumping back in. This was something I had to do in kind of grade 8 guitar, because there'd be parts of the solo that are written, and then there's other parts which is saying, right, your improvisation, and then it might have a way that it's kind of, you have to end it this way. And so there's this pathway that you have to kind of carve yourself. I think that's a really interesting way to start doing this stuff. And so, for instance, you might take a solo that you love, whether it's Living on a Prayer or something like that, and you might think, right, I want to start this solo the same as the original solo starts, and then I want to take it and go somewhere else with it, and then come back to this idea. I think that's a really useful way to start getting better at improvisation. Take some aspect, keep it the same, do a little bit of something different, and come back and do it again. Another thing that can really improve your solo playing in general is kind of writing solos and planning things. And if you do it kind of in a slow, concise way, this is more or less the same thing that you're doing when you're improvising. It's just that when you're actually composing, writing a solo, you get a chance to practice these things over and over. The thing with improvising a solo is you start to get used to this feeling of not having that safety net, and the feeling of you're just exploring ideas in real time. I think it's a real joy. The other real clear thing that you need to have in mind when you're getting better at improvising is that the more you know the home, which might be a major scale home, it might be melodic minor, it might be the pentatonic, the better knowledge you have of whatever the thing is underneath, the more likely you are to be able to sort of improvise in it sensibly. And a case in point, if you asked me to improvise in a scale that I'm unfamiliar with, my improvisation will be much less fluent, much less good than my major scale improvisation, because I've spent so much time learning the ropes and building up this kind of knowledge of the major scale across the fretboard, and building up the kind of ear-finger relationship where I've got, okay, well, this is how this sounds, and sort of these intuitive things that I can improvise quite comfortably in a major scale. If you give me a brand new scale to use, all of that kind of goes away. And I think that's kind of the real key thing to this. You need to really know, I think, quite clearly the home that you're playing in and get familiar with it. And this is also why people like Pat Metheny and people like that talk about practicing improvising over a certain set of changes for days at a time even. And I think someone talks about Coltrane, someone like that, they were practicing some changes and the person went out for the day, and when they came back like late at night, he was still running over the same set of changes. These things take quite a bit of dedication and quite a bit of time to be able to really execute. So if you're feeling kind of one way about your improvisation, bad about it, or whatever, you think, I'm not really a great improviser, that's what I think you can do to take your improvisation to the next level. Make it a thing that you do every single day or every single practice session. Make it a real focus and start to really understand the homes that you're playing in. So whether it's you're playing tunes that are predominantly in major scales, if you're playing over pop tunes and stuff, then that's where your focus might be. If you're playing a lot of blues, then focus on blues, and kind of figure out, where this lies on the fretboard and stuff. And learning other people's licks, of course, really helps with this, because every time you learn a new piece of stuff, potentially it helps to illuminate that little part of the fretboard for you. Chuck in prepared ideas as well, because improvisation is generally, you're never really improvising something that you've never played before. So the deeper your kind of knowledge and your repertoire of things is, the more likely it is that you're going to improvise something vaguely interesting, I would suggest. Those are kind of my tips on this and my thoughts on that. Let me know if you disagree with any of it or you agree with it. I thought it was a really interesting point of view from Frank Zappa. It's not necessarily that improvising is better than writing a solo. In some cases, I think a written solo is going to end up being more potentially interesting and stand the test of time better. But spontaneous kind of improvisation, I think, has a real important role for many of us as well. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Cheers.